Hi, I'm Elizabeth Swanson Goldberg, and I'm an associate professor here at Babson. I teach English, and I work in the Arts and Humanities division. Fortunately for me, I also am enabled to teach human rights, so I was sort of an interdisciplinary scholar who came here, and Babson seems to really appreciate that, and I think that's part of our vision, which is a really good thing, because what I can do in the classroom then is to talk not only about international literature, but also about human rights, and they have a lot in common. The kind of wild card is the business school. Here I am in a business school, never dreamed I'd be teaching here for my career. And people have often asked me, literature, forget about it, but human rights, what does that have to do with business? And is there a sort of oxymoron, is there a paradox in teaching human rights in this business setting when in fact there's a history of business in the human rights arena that has not always been one of great commitment to human rights. And in fact, some human rights offenses, either to people or to the environment, directly or indirectly, have been done through businesses, through both national and transnational companies. There's lots of examples of that. One of the ways, I think the most probably significant ways that that has manifested is in what economists call the resource curse, which is the paradoxical, disproportionate relationship between the amount of natural resources a country has and their economic and political stability. So if you think about, you can think about anywhere on earth that has oil and think about the stability of that place. Think about diamonds and other minerals. Sierra Leone, where there have been terrible wars over diamonds, apartheid in South Africa, one of the most oppressive governments the world has ever known, which was absolutely funded by gold and diamonds. And one of the most recent examples, and perhaps one of the most devastating, the ongoing war in the Congo, in which resources are exploited there. And this is mostly about our cell phones. So I kind of want to take a moment to get the word out about that people are now actually, organizations are calling for conflict-free cell phones, which would mean that transnationals that make cell phones and sell cell phones would find out through the supply chain where things came from, like gold that coats the wires in the cell phone, tantalum that stores the electricity, tungsten, which makes your phone vibrate, or tin, which is the solder for the components. Where did that come from, and who got hurt in the process of someone gaining control of that resource? And so these kinds of long histories of businesses, and again, whether it's directly or indirectly, purposefully or not, sometimes people don't know or feel that they can't discern in the supply chain where that resource came from. There's been a tough relationship between business and human rights. So are they fundamentally at odds? One of the ways that we could say human rights and business have actually participated together and are, I might say, complicit, which again doesn't have a very positive ring, is that the history of the colonization of the globe in the 19th century really is a business history. The colonial charters that sort of were the forward guard of colonization by Europe of about 87% of the rest of the earth, so all of Africa, big chunks of Asia, Latin America, etc., were businesses. So the British East India Company, which was trading in India and was the foothold into then absolutely colonizing that space and governing it from afar, which was an oppressive history, and it's one that, of course, people and citizens and scholars argue about. Was there some good that came from it? Of course there was some good that came from it, but it was also very exploitative and quite brutal at times. So those colonial charters, those businesses that went in with a charter to do business, also had human rights language in their charters. And that human rights language actually has made its way right into our contemporary human rights documents, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the UN. You can trace that right back to some of those colonial charters, which said, if we're going to do business somewhere else, we need to protect the natives. We need to bring them things. We need to sort of give back, and that was the language. And what that meant was we'll bring the 3 C's, Christianity, civilization, and commerce. And that was meant to be a sort of a gift. What it ended up doing was was destroying cultures in many cases, and also pulling countries right into a capitalist economy that they weren't. They had no sort of natural inclination to be part of, and what it meant was that their resources could be exploited and their labor as well. So that again makes business, you sort of end up thinking, okay, business is complicit irrevocably with human rights violations, and is there any way that business could have a positive relationship with human rights? And I would come to say, as a scholar and a professor working in this environment, that yes, business is both complicit with human rights violations, and it now can play a very positive role in protecting human rights. When I teach human rights here at Babson, I ground all of my courses in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which does in fact have some of its origin in those colonial charters. Part of its problem, and it's the document that came at the end of World War II, it was drafted between 1945 and 1948. One of the problems with it is that much of the earth was still colonized, so those people, mainly the African countries, sub-Saharan Africa, were not at the table. So you could easily dismiss it as an imperialist document. However, there were lots of people from around the world, China, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, lots of other non-Western powers that had a lot to do with drafting that. One of the weaknesses of that document is that it is, while it's a moral discourse and it's about protecting the basic rights of all humans, it only works as a legal document. You're only protected if you are recognized by the law as a person. You're only recognized by the law as a person when you are a citizen of a country recognized. And so you can think about if for some reason your citizenship is in question, if you're a refugee, if you're an immigrant, if you're a political asylee, or if you're otherwise, your citizenship, if your country itself, its status as a recognized country is in jeopardy, then you are just a human. You are no longer a legal person. You are the most vulnerable. You need your human rights the most, and that document will fail you. You have nowhere to go to seek redress. The most dramatic instance of this, and one of the reasons this document was brought into being, was because of the tactic of the Nazis to strip away the citizenship of Jewish people before then being able to concentrate them in ghettos and then send them off to camps to implement the so-called final solution. So first, they had to be absolutely unprotected by a state. So that's a problem. There's lots of other problems with this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One of them is that it was split into two covenants. It went from being just a statement, a declaration, to a covenant or a promise in 1966. It took that long and that much haggling to actually get something that was ratified by countries, and it had to be split because of the Cold War context into a covenant on civil and political rights on the one hand, and economic, social, and cultural rights on the other. Economic rights just felt plain old too communist, too socialist for most of the Western capitalist democracies to sign on to. The idea that one has the right to food did not seem, it's often talked about as an aspiration and not a right. Of course, many people will come back and say, if you're starving, your political rights don't really much matter. So there's quite a lot of contention around this issue. The UN has really tried, I think, to step into the breach where those two covenants are, and the latter one hasn't been signed by the US, by the way, and by many other countries. The economic and social and cultural human rights has not been ratified by us. So the UN now has tried to do some other things to address this problem. One of the things it did was in 1999, it launched the Global Compact. Kofi Annan was then director of the UN and our General Secretary, and he launched it at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And what that said was, okay, we know that businesses have responsibilities to the humans and the environment in the places that they operate, and more they're operating globally and transnationally. So we know that they have a responsibility to protect human rights, to protect the environment, make it sustainable, what they're doing there, to protect labor standards, and to make sure they don't participate in corruption. So they launched a global compact that businesses and corporations signed on to. The language of that document and that treaty actually comes right out of the Universal Declaration, protecting human human rights as they've been proclaimed there. And so that was a great first step. It really is a way to try to hold corporations accountable for human rights protections and to actually invite businesses to get creative about how they're going to operate ethically all over the world. But then some people, and some folks at the UN and some people in business noticed, well, if you're going to change business practice in this way so that you're thinking about value not only as profit, but also as sustainable environmental practices and sustainable cultural practices and the protection of human rights, then you better start educating people in a different way. You can't educate people in business programs at undergraduate and graduate levels to be focused on a bottom line and then expect that corporate practices will somehow be different and rise to a different kind of ethical standard. So last year, 2009, the Principles for Responsible Management Education was launched at the UN, and one of our most wonderful faculty members and our undergraduate dean, Dennis Hanno, was part of really getting that initiative off the ground, and then I had the great privilege of attending the launch with him. And basically now what we're doing is taking it down to the level of education and saying we're going to develop the ability of students to be future generators of value that's sustainable. It's not just about profit, but it's also about value in the environment, value for people. And also that economy, that global economy, will be inclusive, that there will not be millions of people who are excluded from a viable economic life, that there will not be starving people all over the planet. So those are the sort of goals that we think about when we think about the PRME, or the Principles for Responsible Management Education. And it's really quite wonderful to see, I can say as a professor, for years and years now, well before anyone at the UN thought it up or any professors really even started talking about it, it was the students who would come in and say, you know what, we need to be doing something different. I'm worried about how, as a business person, I'll be able to make positive change. I want to do that. So it's been my delight as a faculty member and as someone who's learning as I go how to be a human rights activist and someone who understands the capacity for business to make positive change, to see my students coming right up the next generation doing all the work. So if you have an interest in learning about those frameworks, you could visit the UN, the Principles for Responsible Management Education, which is the UN, unprme.org, and check out what's going on.